Hi, this is Helen Tarrant. Hi, this is Helen Tarrant and welcome to another episode of Commercial Property Roadshow. Now, today I'm going to cover off which one do you get the better return. Do you get a better return in commercial or do you get a better return in residential, especially in this current market? Now, one of the things I want to talk to you about is not about getting the return, it's actually what you're looking for. So the return on the property depends on what you can do with it. So I think the best thing for us to look at the moment is the actual potential. Do you get better potential with a commercial property versus a residential property? Now that's very personal and that's something for you to actually decide, because you have to look at your strategy and your long-term goals and see what works for you. But when I look at residential, so let's talk about residential property. When you start out with residential, mostly you'll buy a house or an apartment. If you buy an apartment, if it's an old apartment in an established area, what you would get is you'll be able to refurbish that property, and then you'll be able to sell it for a higher price, or you could create instant equity and then pull out that money to use again for the next property, or alternatively you might be able to rent it out for a higher rental return. So those are the options if you have those three options of what you have when you have a apartment. But if you bought a house, there's lots of different things you can do with it, especially if it's got land. You can build at the back, so you can add a granny flat at the back, you can do an extension. Effectively you can add the value to that property and add an additional basically increase the value and add additional income to that property. So you could create a dual income property, and that may mean that the property is actually self-supporting, because all residential properties start out with being negative. So you're negative in cash flow, so you're holding it. The strategy is that you're holding it for the long-term growth of that property. So therefore for you, you've got to look at ways of maximizing that cash flow. So most of the time is about building a granny flat at the back, or for some people we might be subdividing at the back and reselling, or alternatively you might just want to do a refurbishment and get higher rents as well. So there's so many options in residential if you're looking at trying to bring in cash flow. But even if you do that, you might find the money you put into it will only make the property neutral, cash flow neutral. So you can actually hold the property without taking too much money out of your own pocket. So therefore you can hold the property until you get the capital gains in the future. So that is the strategy, and that is really getting the value. So the value for you would be to be able to pull out an extra $100,000 or $200,000 out of that property. Now if you are looking at buying commercial, the goal then changes, because the value of that property is determined by a few things. Firstly, the quality of the property, the build itself, and the location, because you might be buying a property in a location that cannot be replaced. So you might be on a corner intersection, you might have really good exposure, you might be in a really well established area, and you might be part of other mixed tenants there that is really sought after. A-class tenants, A-class building, just cannot be replaced. So you might be part of that. Secondly, you might find that you are in an area, you are actually buying the tenant itself. So you might have a ASX listed tenant, you might have a national tenant or a franchise tenant, so a branded tenant. In that case, then your property is worth X amount of dollars because of that tenant in there, and you can sit back and basically enjoy the set and forget of that property. Now long-term wise, if you're looking at building value into it, now commercial property is based on the tenant, so a lot of times the strategy behind that is, if you want to create value, is to buy a property that is not tenanted, so a vacant property, and then look at putting the tenant in there. That will require you to refurbish the property, that will require you to advertise for a tenant. There's a certain amount of holding cost, and then when you put a tenant in, the property can go up to as much as 30, 40, and sometimes even 50% of its original value. So it's all about how to buy in a key area and attracting that kind of tenant. And sometimes properties are vacant, not because it's in a bad location or because it's been there for a long time, or it's just not the right property. It can just be there because it actually never been looked after, it never been marketed right, it's never been configured properly. Because if you have a really large premise and you're trying to rent out 500 square meters, it's very hard to find that tenant. Whereas if you cut that up into three different types, three different little tenants, you might be only tenanting 150 or 200 square meters each time, and it'll be much easier. And therefore then you've created a property instead of 500 square meters to one tenant, and you created three little tenancies in there, three multi-tenanted, and it becomes more valuable. Therefore there's more people buying that property. So The value in commercial property is, first you look at location. I think that applies to both residential and commercial, but also you look at the tenant. So the best type of tenant you can get there, or if there's an opportunity to change that tenant and create a higher return from either the increase in rent, or there is the drop in the return because you've caught or you manage to list it out to a brand name tenant, all of a sudden the value of the property increases because there's more demand for people who want to buy name tenants. So it's all about creating security and longevity in a commercial property deal. So as long as you can get a property that is volatile and insecure in the eyes of the investor, but then change that to a secure property with longevity and with security. So say you got a tenant let's say you get a tenant that's a hairdressing tenant, and even though they might have been there for 15 years, it might be on a month-to-month lease. The property may be run down because it hasn't been refurbished for 15 years. It might be that the tenants have operated out of there and really there hasn't been maintained properly. You come in, you buy that property at a much higher return. So you buy it at 8% or 9% because it's just run down and the vendor just want to get rid of it. You might need to go, well, you know what, I don't want this tenant in there because this area has changed in the last 15 years, become a professional tenant. I'm going to kick this tenant out because they're on a month-to-month lease and I can do that. They're paying under market rent. I'm going to do a full refurbishment. So I'm going to gut it. I'm going to paint it. I'm going to put new lighting in. I'm going to create new amenities, maybe disabled toilets, new doorways, all of that. And then I'm going to attract a different tenant. You might attract a dentist tenant who is probably going to pay market rent. So they're probably going to pay market or a little bit above. So therefore, all of a sudden you might have had a 30% increase in your rent or 40% increase in your rent. But also people out there are looking for dentist tenants because they see it as security, and that the tenant is going to spend $400,000 on a fit out, and therefore they're going to be there for the long term. And once you've got a property with a dentist in it, most of the time it stays as a dentist property. So therefore you could have the tenant being there for 10 years and they could sign a 5-year lease. All of a sudden the demand, people will pay higher prices, and you'll find that the yield drops from 8% to 6%. So all of a sudden people are willing to pay more because of this tenant, and then you've got your capital growth and your equity that's instantly built there. And that's how you create value in a commercial property. In residential, you have to actually do more things to the actual property itself. So it's the house and the property and the land, having more creative ways to do that to increase the cash flow, to make it neutral so you can sustain your investment, and then hold out as the area gentrifies and the value goes up as a general across the market. In commercial, you can take a property that is run down and old with a tenant that's underperforming, turn it around, and the location matters less than the actual tenants you put back in there and the refurbishments that you've done, because that will increase the value and increase your cash flow. So you might even want to hold it because the tenant's now a really key blue chip tenant, but then you want to sell that property and you've got that value back or the equity back, and you can do another deal. And that's essentially how people grow in their commercial property portfolio, is that they leap and they do these kind of chunk deals, and with these deals, every time they can build up bigger deposits and they can do bigger deals in the future. So if you're thinking about getting into commercial property and you're not sure of the right way, and you may be thinking this is the right strategy, well, go to helentarrant.com, send me a message, you find out more. I'd love to help you with more education or jump on a call with you and work out your specific strategy. So I look forward to helping you and seeing you on the next video. Bye for now.